This video is sponsored by Squarespace. As someone whose livelihood is primarily on YouTube, I know it's always a wise policy to carve out your own space online with a website, store, or portfolio of work. Squarespace is ideal if you want to create a website quickly and easily. No coding needed, simply select a pre-built, fully customizable template and then adjust it to your own style and layout using easy-to-use drag-and-drop tools, or build one from scratch if that's more your thing. Either way, you'll be able to have your own website up and running in no time. For my own site, obviously I make a lot of videos, which is why Squarespace's portfolios, galleries, and video block features are ideal for the kind of site I want to create. Squarespace also allows you to create each website with a custom protected domain name, which can help your website reach the right audience. For example, by using a specific domain name like .art. All this and more is available for you to check out by clicking the link in the description. Head over to squarespace.com/Rowan J. Coleman and use the promo code Rowan J. Coleman for 10% off your first purchase. Thank you again to Squarespace for helping me keep the lights on over here. Superman the movie and its sequel Superman 2 had been critical and box office triumphs. However, the release of Superman 3 broke this positive streak with a baffling and convoluted movie which disappointed critics, audiences, and many of its cast and crew. As the producers behind the series scrambled to continue the franchise, no one could have imagined that the worst was still yet to come. Following the letdown of Superman 3, Christopher Reeve chose to step away from the role, having fulfilled his original 3-film contract with the Salkinds. Nevertheless, the Salkinds were still confident they would one day produce a 4th Superman movie, but with Reeve for now out of the picture, they hoped to reinvigorate the franchise with a Supergirl movie. Elias Salkind had originally wanted to use Supergirl in his original treatment for Superman 3. However, after that treatment was rejected by Warner Brothers, the Salkinds decided the character would best be suited for her own solo movie.
When I auditioned for the movie, it was all the same people involved, the Salkinds and Timothy Burrell and Alf Joint, who trained me for Supergirl. That was Chris's same guy. All the people where I learned how to fly, those were all the same people that had worked with Chris and on the Superman movies, so there were a lot of similar crossover.
Starring Helen Slater in the title role and joined by Faye Dunaway and Peter O'Toole, Supergirl the movie was released in 1984. Much like Superman 3, however, it failed to impress audiences and critics alike and was a huge box office bomb. Though there is much technical competency on screen with impressive visual effects and an excellent score by Jerry Goldsmith, the story is a strange mishmash of magic, monsters, and love triangles. Helen Slater is well cast in the lead role, but unfortunately the script lets her character down immensely. Much like Superman 3, it seems the Salkinds didn't have enough faith in the source material alone in crafting the movie, instead trying to cash in on contemporary trends. It's not terrible by any means, and in my opinion fares a bit better than Superman 3, but it's a poor big screen debut for the Supergirl character.
I did a movie after Supergirl called The Legend of Billie Jean, and even in that film, they got it a little bit more right about an 18-year-old, 17-year-old going through certain rites of passage, and I felt like in Supergirl, they were shying away from it, I think just because there was so much money in the film and so much kind of expectation, they couldn't really explore a girl's journey, and my wish is that now they would revisit that kind of story and find a way to tell it with depth and humor and a story that you can actually follow.
While the Salkinds had already announced plans for a Superman 4, the commercial failure of Supergirl and Santa Claus the movie, which in many ways was attempting to replicate the success of Superman, convinced the producers the film series had run its course. Therefore, they sold the Superman film rights to Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus, the heads of the Cannon Film Group. For much of the late 70s and 80s, the Cannon Film Group had acquired quite an unfavourable reputation in the American film industry as incompetent, lowbrow schlock peddlers. With infamous flops like The Apple and Sahara under their belt, they had been sustained largely by low-budget action movies such as their Delta Force, Death Wish, and Ninja movies, with the occasional genuine hit like Break-In. However, by the mid to late 80s, Cannon had begun making attempts to move into blockbuster filmmaking, with their duo of Alan Quatermain movies, Life Force, Invaders from Mars, and Masters of the Universe. Acquiring the Superman film rights was another one of their big swings to sit at the same table with Hollywood's major studios. However, to get the movie off the ground, it was felt they needed Christopher Reeve. Reeve was still incredibly hesitant to return to the Superman role, but unfortunately his career outside the film series had never really taken off. He had largely stuck to independent dramas, as the majority of roles he was offered by major studios were shallow action movie parts he had little interest in. Therefore, when Cannon approached him with an offer to produce his passion project, Street Smart, and promised him creative oversight of Superman 4, Reeve finally agreed to reprise the Superman character. Unfortunately, due to a lack of marketing, Street Smart was yet again another flop for Cannon, although it did merit positive reviews from critics and featured a breakout role for Morgan Freeman, who earned an Oscar nomination for his performance. Even so, Cannon had held up their end of the deal, and so Reeve proceeded with the development of Superman 4. With creative control over the film's story, Reeve wanted to tackle the subject of nuclear disarmament. When consulting Richard Donner, however, Reeve was advised to keep Superman away from anything he could outright cure. Nevertheless, it was a topic Reeve was personally passionate about, and thus writers Lawrence Koner and Mark Rosenthal were hired to pen the script. Reeve also petitioned to direct the film himself, but was deemed too inexperienced, though he did direct several second unit sequences. Initially, Wes Craven was hired to helm the film, but he and Reeve didn't work well together. Reeve, who had input on the choice of director, recommended Ron Howard, but Canadian filmmaker Sidney J. Furie was hired instead. For the cast of the movie, Cannon was able to entice many of the regulars back with large pay deals, such as Margot Kidder, Mark McClure, Jackie Cooper, and even Gene Hackman. Joining the returning cast members were a number of newcomers. Mariel Hemingway as Lacey Warfield, John Cryer as Lenny Luthor, and Mark Pillow as Nuclear Man. Mariel Hemingway was an up-and-coming star at the time, with acclaimed performances in Personal Best, Star 80, and Manhattan. John Cryer was also a rising star at the time, having had his breakout role in John Hughes' Pretty in Pink. He has since reappeared in the DC universe as Lex Luthor in the CW's Arrowverse. Mark Pillow had barely any acting experience outside of a few small television roles. However, his commanding physical presence and enthusiasm for stunts won him the part. Principal photography began in 1986. Unlike previous Superman films, Superman 4 would be entirely shot in England as a cost-cutting measure. Elstree Studios, which Cannon had bought several years earlier, was used instead of Pinewood, and the city of Milton Keynes stood in for Metropolis due to the prevalence of steel and glass buildings. It wasn't long into filming before Reeve and the others realised Superman 4 would not match the quality of the first two films. Although Cannon had originally promised a budget of $35 million, comparable to Superman 3, the company's financial troubles soon saw this budget slashed down to $17 million. While this was still enough to produce a fine film, there were no alterations made to the script to accommodate this new budget, and instead the production had to move forward without the resources it needed. Christopher Reeve later recalled, "We were hampered by budget constraints and cutbacks in all departments. Cannon Films had nearly 30 projects in the works at the time, and Superman 4 received no special consideration. For example, Koner and Rosenthal wrote a scene in which Superman lands on 42nd Street and walks down the double yellow line to the United Nations, where he gives a speech. If that had been a scene in Superman 1, we would actually have shot on 42nd Street. Richard Donner would have choreographed hundreds of pedestrians and vehicles and cut to people gawking out of office windows at the sight of Superman walking down the street like a Pied Piper. Instead, we had to shoot at an industrial park in England in the rain with about 100 or so extras, not a car in sight, and a dozen pigeons thrown in for atmosphere. Even if the story had been brilliant, I don't think that we could have ever lived up to the audience's expectations with this approach." These budget cuts severely impacted the general morale of the shoot. Reeve was left frustrated as he struggled to finish his second unit work without the resources he needed. His directing duties often had to extend to the first unit as well, as Sidney J. Furie, sick of Cannon's incompetence, essentially gave up trying to rescue the film, putting in little effort in directing a number of scenes. The situation was even worse with the special and visual effects departments. When the crew tried to explain to Cannon they didn't have the resources to create the needed shots, they were fired from the film and replaced by Israeli crews Golan and Globus had worked with on their earlier films. Thankfully, these cutbacks did not negatively affect the music of the film. Alexander Courage, famous for his work on Star Trek the original series and a close friend to John Williams, was hired to create the score for Superman 4. Like Ken Thorne before him, Courage insisted on retaining all of John Williams' original motifs and themes from Superman the movie, rearranging them and combining them with his own new material. While Courage had composed over 2 hours of music, the finished film would be cut down to 90 minutes after disastrous early test screenings. One of the many scenes cut was an earlier version of Nuclear Man who somewhat resembles Bizarro, who battles Superman in an alleyway. After production wrapped, Reeve and the others knew Superman 4: The Quest for Peace was going to be yet another disappointment, and on the 23rd of July 1987, they braced themselves for the inevitable. While I have my problems with Superman 3, at least it looked like a finished movie. A blockbuster executed to a high technical standard. Superman 4, on the other hand, doesn't even have this going for it. There is a shocking lack of polish in many scenes. The direction has no coherence, and often the staging is simplistic and dull. It makes the moments where the movie strays from boring into laughably bad at least feel refreshing. The choice to shoot in Milton Keynes wasn't necessarily a bad one, as in many shots it does indeed resemble an American city. However, on more than one occasion the reality of the locations is obvious. This shot was supposed to have a matte painting of the rest of the city, which was never finished. When Nuclear Man levitates a group of civilians, the camera pans up, revealing the entire street is simply built on the Elstree Studios backlot. And this train station is clearly part of a London Underground and not a New York-style subway. There's only so many corners which can be cut before the entire reality of a film collapses, and this is most apparent with the visual effects. In truth, there is actually some good work in here. The miniature effects are largely very strong across the board. The Great Wall of China and volcano miniatures are especially strong. However, it's the opticals and flying effects which have suffered the most from all the cutbacks. This shot of Superman flying towards camera is infamously reused about a dozen times throughout the movie. In general, all of the composited images have a washed out and flat look to them, and when it comes to the wire work, there seems to be no thought given to momentum, perspective, or movements of the people on screen. The sequence of Superman flying with Lois is full of strange speed changes between edits, and one occasion where Lois seems to be flying when she's supposed to be falling. One aspect of the movie which does excel, however, when it comes to the presentation is the music. Alexander Courage's score is absolutely fantastic. Being a huge Star Trek fan means I've been a fan of his work since early childhood, and his adaptations of John Williams' themes and motifs are brilliant. Honestly, this is probably the best the Superman March and Love themes have sounded outside of the first movie. That recognizable full sound, which I felt was largely missing from Ken Thorne's work, has returned in Courage's score. There's a kind of jazziness, for lack of a better word, to all of the brass and percussion, which really revitalizes these familiar themes. And Courage's original music for Nuclear Man, which incorporates synthesizers, is also fantastic. It's a memorable, singable theme with a textural richness which dominates the entire score. If you've never listened to the soundtrack independently of the movie, I'd highly recommend doing so. Another positive for the movie is of course Christopher Reeve as Superman. Despite the length of time between movies and his own on-set frustration, his performance is still brilliant. He pretty much carries the whole movie. Even Gene Hackman returning as Lex Luthor doesn't really satisfy. The wit of the character from the first two films is absent, meaning most of his dialogue is pretty generic, often repeating lines from Superman 1 and 2. The rest of the regulars, Margot Kidder, Mark McClure, and Jackie Cooper, are given very little to do. The same can be said for newcomer Mariel Hemingway. Lacey is just a very thin character, a simple damsel for Nuclear Man to kidnap and Superman to rescue. Nuclear Man himself fares a little better though thanks to sheer physicality. Despite being dubbed by Gene Hackman, Pillow's facial expressions and athletic ability at least makes him a memorable and threatening adversary for Superman to contend with. Even though there is so little positive to say about Superman 4, I might actually prefer it to Superman 3. Because while Superman 3 was certainly executed with more competence, teaming Superman up with Richard Pryor for a caper involving supercomputers and financial schemes pretty much doomed that movie from the start. Superman 4, however, at least has the foundation of a generally good idea. As Richard Donner advised, Superman is usually kept away from anything he can cure, but I suspect that's why Reeve saw the concept as such fertile ground for a good story. There are potential themes in the idea about Superman's hubris getting the better of him and how he needs to trust regular people more, and considering the context of his final speech at the end, I suspect this is exactly what Reeve was going for. However, either due to the issues with the script or the budget cutbacks, this arc is virtually non-existent in the final product. While the Salkinds always seem to want to restrain Superman's stories, conceptually Superman 4 aims to do the opposite. The scope of the story and scale of the action is huge, which is what makes the failures of the film a genuine shame, because if there was the time, money, and care taken with these ideas, I can see the quest for peace being a good, even great Superman story. Unfortunately, however, it was let down by its producers and shoved out the door in the hopes of making a quick buck. Even so, the legitimate strength of the ideas behind the movie have always fascinated me. And in spite of how poorly the finished film was put together, it at least means huge swaths of the film end up veering into so bad it's good territory. Watched with a group of friends and a few drinks, Superman 4 can be enjoyed. While that's a truly sad status for a Superman film to occupy, it at least makes it more fun to watch than its predecessor. In the end, Superman 4: The Quest for Peace is not just an unmitigated disaster, but a deep tragedy. The hopes of a cast and crew trying to recapture the magic of the original film, dashed by the blundering of producers who saw the Superman brand as something they could cash in on to keep their fledgling company afloat. Though it's not all bad and it can be enjoyed in the right context, Superman 4 can only be regarded as a tragic failure. Upon release, Superman 4: The Quest for Peace was panned by critics and audiences alike. It grossed $36 million worldwide against its $17 million budget, possibly scraping by to break even. Today, Superman 4 is regarded as one of the worst movies ever made. However, that hasn't stopped one fan by the name of Aaron Price attempting to remaster the film by himself, restoring the cut footage and replacing many of the substandard visual effects. Some of the clips released so far have been incredibly impressive. While I don't think the available material, restored or otherwise, facilitates the film being rescued, it's certainly something I'd be curious to see should the full remaster ever come to fruition. But back in the late 80s, the failure of Superman 4 killed the Superman film series dead. The goodwill from the first entries had all but expired. It wouldn't be until 2006, 19 years later, that Superman would return to the big screen, with many hoping this would be the character's triumphant resurrection as a blockbuster icon. Thank you for watching. If you like my videos, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and make sure to hit the bell icon to stay up to date with all of my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my Patreon or YouTube members using the links down below. There you can see videos early as well as some exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.